Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the Johnson family of 1821 Massachusetts and the horrifying secret they kept locked away in their attic that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we will explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the autumn of 1821, as the first light of dawn struggled to pierce the thick, chilling mist that clung to the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, a discovery was made that would forever leave a deep, festering scar upon the soul of a young nation. The air that morning was unusually cold for the season, carrying a dampness that seemed to seep into the very bones, turning every breath into a ghostly white plume. This was not the discovery of treasure, nor of some forgotten historical relic. It was the unveiling of a horror so profound, a truth so contrary to the very fabric of human decency, that it would haunt the collective memory of the region for generations. Inside the hidden, suffocating confines of an attic, within a farmhouse that appeared utterly ordinary, 14 children were found. Their ages, as best as could be determined, ranged from the tender innocence of 5 to the cusp of adolescence at 15. They were pale, their skin stretched taut over delicate bones, a testament to a cruel and prolonged starvation. One of the first men on the scene, a neighboring farmer named Abner Collins, drawn by a faint, unplaceable sound, would later speak of the silence not a peaceful quiet, but a suppressed silence, as if life itself was being forcibly held back. Clad in nothing more than tattered, threadbare colonial garments, they huddled together in the oppressive darkness. The stench was overwhelming, a sickening mixture of unwashed bodies, sickness, and despair. One small girl, no older than 7, was found clutching a crudely carved wooden bird, its wings broken, a pathetic symbol of a freedom she had never known. Their eyes, wide and dark in their gaunt faces, held a terror so absolute that words could scarcely describe it. When their rescuers, with voices gentle and trembling with pity mixed with disbelief, asked their names, the children could not form words. Some tried, only to produce a hoarse, painful croak from their trembling lips. Through choked sobs came only a single, whispered word, a title that should have signified love and safety, but had instead become a harbinger of their torment. "Mother," they whispered. "Mother Johnson." The local sheriff's report, hastily scrawled in ink that seemed to bleed with the urgency of the moment, and later tucked away in the dusty archives of the Salem courthouse, described a scene so shocking that one hardened deputy was said to have fallen to his knees upon entering the cramped, foul space. The report noted the rusty chains bolted to the floorboards, some of which had cut into the ankles of the older children, creating raw, infected wounds. It was the moment that shattered the fragile illusion of safety that had long defined this close-knit community. It was the moment the mask was ripped away, revealing a monstrous, calculated evil that had been hiding for over a decade, in plain sight. To understand how such an atrocity could fester, one must understand the world that allowed it to exist. The year 1821 found Massachusetts at a crossroads, a society caught between the fading echoes of old traditions and the uncertain promises of new beginnings. The Revolutionary War was a memory, while the scars of the War of 1812 were still relatively new. Salem, a century earlier the site of the infamous witch trials, was by then a respectable coastal town, eager to bury the ghost of its hysterical past. This legacy, however, had a chilling side effect, a deep-seated fear of false accusations, which made people extremely hesitant to voice suspicions against their neighbors, for fear of being seen as gossips or troublemakers. The Industrial Revolution had not yet fully taken root. Consequently, most communities, like Salem and its rural outskirts, still lived by the rhythms of the land. It was a society deeply rooted in the moral foundation of churchgoers, of unwavering trust in neighbors, and the firm, almost naive belief that such profound evil simply could not exist among decent, God-fearing people. The fictional but entirely plausible hamlet of Oakside is a typical example of the close-knit rural life of that era. There is an anecdote often shared by Reverend Hill about how he once forgot to lock the church's donation box for a whole week. Yet not a single shilling was lost, a story told with pride, reinforcing the town's dangerous belief in its own inherent goodness. This belief was further reinforced by local folklore, tales of spirits in the nearby Hockomock Swamp, which made the populace more inclined to attribute strange noises to supernatural forces rather than to human malice. A few years prior, a woman had mentioned to the Reverend that she thought she heard odd hammering sounds from the Johnson place at night. He had gently dismissed it as the workings of the wind and an overactive imagination. That response effectively silenced any further inquiry. Picture a landscape with about 40 families. Their homes spread across gentle hills. The dirt roads connecting them were often impassable after heavy rains, increasing the isolation of the outlying farms. Most residents were humble farmers or artisans. On Sundays, without fail, everyone gathered at the white-steepled Congregational Church, where Reverend Hill would preach sermons on piety and the dangers of sin. In 1821, nearly everyone in Oakside knew each other's business, or so they thought. Doors were often unlocked. Children played freely in each other's farms. It was the kind of community where any newcomer was noticed, but once accepted, people were willing to mind their own business. It was a confidence born of simplicity, the confidence of a small town that believed it had no real secrets. The local constable was an elderly, complacent man who trusted Reverend Hill's judgment implicitly, creating a vacuum in official oversight. There was a stray dog, a scruffy brown mutt children called Scamp, known for barking ferociously whenever it passed the Johnson property. Then, one day, the dog simply vanished into this world of quiet faith. A new couple arrived in the spring of 1811, Thomas Johnson, a tall, quiet man with calloused hands but eyes that seemed to constantly avoid the gaze of others, and his wife, Elizabeth, a woman of quiet disposition, purchased an old two-story farmhouse on the edge of the village. They paid for the property in cash, with gold coins, a highly unusual act that, while sparking brief curiosity, also served to quell any questions about their financial origins. The property itself was one that others had avoided. It bordered a stretch of marshy, undesirable land, and the house had a reputation for being perpetually damp and gloomy. There was a rumor that its previous owner, a solitary widower, had lost his mind to the isolation. It was set slightly apart from the nearest neighbors, at the end of a rutted lane crossed by a rickety wooden bridge that was seldom maintained, further enhancing its seclusion. The fact that the Johnsons managed to make that stubborn land yield a small but tidy garden in their first year earned them a quiet respect. Yet, astute observers might have noticed the complete absence of typical domestic smells, no scent of baking bread, no savory aroma of simmering stew ever drifted from their chimney. Initially, neighbors found the Johnsons to be friendly, if reserved. Thomas claimed to be a veteran indeed. A faded 1812 infantry coat hung on a peg by their door. He had a habit of sitting on his porch for hours, whittling pieces of wood with an unnerving, focused intensity, his face a complete blank. Elizabeth, by all accounts, was the picture of modest amiability. Those who met her described a lady with a lace cap always neatly pinned over her brown hair, who spoke just above a whisper, though her hands were surprisingly rough and strong for such a delicate demeanor. She once spent an entire afternoon meticulously mending a tear in a village girl's dress, a gesture seen as incredibly kind, but in hindsight, revealed an almost obsessive need for control. On another occasion, she presented a neighbor, a young mother exhausted by her three boisterous sons, with a small handmade sachet of lavender and chamomile, saying it was to help soothe unruly spirits. The comment was delivered with a gentle smile that nonetheless felt like a sharp rebuke. When the blacksmith's wife tried to inquire about Elizabeth's family in the East, Elizabeth skillfully deflected the question with a gentle smile, a quiet but firm drawing of a boundary that no one dared to cross again. Outwardly, the Johnsons seemed like a normal, even blessed couple, except for one detail that attracted both sympathy and idle gossip. They had no children. In a community where families of 6, 8, or even 10 children were commonplace, the quiet, childless state of the Johnson household was noticed. Some neighbors pitied them, assuming that God, in his infinite wisdom, had not seen fit to bless them with children. Others quietly speculated that perhaps Elizabeth had had miscarriages, a theory reinforced by the fact that the previous inhabitants of the farm had tragically lost 2 children to fever, adding to the property's sad history. The Johnsons never corrected these assumptions, allowing the quiet tragedy to become their shield. This single, visible sorrow in their otherwise placid lives would become the perfect, unassailable justification for the horror that was to follow. It made what happened later seem, at first, not like a monstrous crime, but like an act of profound and benevolent charity. About a year after settling in, the inciting conflict began not with a bang, but with a pious whisper. Elizabeth Johnson confided in the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Rebecca Hill, during a quiet afternoon tea. "My arms ache with emptiness," she reportedly said, her teacup trembling slightly in its saucer, her voice soft with practiced sorrow. "Thomas is a good man, but a house without the laughter of children is merely a structure, not a home. I feel it is God's will that I become a mother to those who have none." In the Massachusetts of the 1810s, this was a sentiment seen as downright saintly. Formal orphanages were virtually non-existent outside of large cities, and the care of parentless children often fell to the community. The system of binding out or apprenticing poor children was common, an arrangement where officials placed a child with a family in exchange for food, lodging, and the teaching of a trade. In theory, it was a compassionate system. In reality, it often meant a source of free labor with little to no oversight. The town's selectmen of Salem, burdened by an overcrowded almshouse, were all too happy to have a respectable, church-going family take an orphan off their hands. The first child to enter the Johnson home was a 7-year-old boy named Caleb. Church records state his parents had died of a fever in 1812, leaving him with no living relatives. The Johnsons' offer was seen as an answer to prayers. At Caleb's baptism into their care, the community gathered. Neighbors recalled Elizabeth standing at the front pew, the small, nervous boy beside her. She had sewn him a new shirt and rested a hand on his shoulder that seemed, to all, a gesture of comfort. No one in that church could have imagined that this moment of apparent kindness was the first step into a calculated nightmare. For a little while, it seemed the Johnsons were truly providing a loving home. Caleb was occasionally seen with Thomas in the fields, learning to milk the cow or carry firewood. One afternoon, a kindly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, offered Caleb a freshly picked apple as he passed her fence, before the boy could take it. Elizabeth appeared at his side as if from nowhere. "That is so kind of you," she said, her voice sweet as honey. "But Caleb has a delicate stomach. We must be so careful with his diet." She gently guided the boy away, leaving Mrs. Gable with the uneaten apple and a faint, inexplicable sense of unease. When other townsfolk asked the boy how he liked his new family, he would answer softly, "Mrs. Johnson is very good to me." Though his eyes remained downcast and his voice lacked any trace of childish enthusiasm, people simply assumed he was shy or still grieving. Over the next few years, the Johnsons gradually took in more children. They never took too many at once. A careful, deliberate pacing that avoided raising alarm. By 1815, they had also accepted two young sisters, Hannah and Mary, whose sailor father had been lost at sea, and a quiet 11-year-old orphan from Boston named Agnes. Each time, the community applauded their charity. It was around this time that Thomas began expanding the attic. He told a neighbor, Mr. Pritchard, that he was finishing the garret as a nice big bedroom for the young ones. On sunny days, villagers could hear the muffled sounds of hammering and sawing. Thomas, with a hired carpenter, reinforced the attic floor and installed a sturdy new door at the top of the narrow stairway, a door fitted with a heavy iron bolt. The carpenter later mentioned that Thomas had been unusually specific about the door's strength, insisting on a second, lower bolt, to keep the drafts out. Thomas also purchased a heavy, oversized padlock from a traveling smith, claiming it was for his barn. Though the existing barn door was flimsy and could barely support such a lock, outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. The Johnsons would arrive at church on Sunday with one or two of their wards, never all of them at once, but often a child who looked reasonably healthy, if a bit wan and timid. One week, young Mary appeared with a faint, yellowish bruise on her cheek. Elizabeth, noticing the concerned glances, explained with a sigh that Mary had taken a terrible tumble in the hayloft, and wrapped her arm even more tightly around the girl. Elizabeth would sit with the child in the pew, her arm wrapped protectively around their shoulders, a perfect tableau of maternal care. When asked about the other children, she would offer a sad smile and explain that some were feeling unwell or were a little too shy to come out. These excuses raised no alarm. Illnesses were common, and who could blame a traumatized orphan for being shy? However, even in those early days, the first subtle cracks in their facade began to appear. The children they brought to church rotated frequently. One farmer's wife kindly asked Elizabeth one Sunday, "How many children have you got living with you now?" Elizabeth laughed softly. "Oh goodness, I've lost count. We're just helping out wherever the need arises. Some stay, some move on." This answer seemed perfectly reasonable. The assumption was that the Johnsons were a temporary haven, a stopover for orphans. This transience, far from arousing suspicion, actually reinforced their reputation for selfless service. The pressure began to escalate with small, unsettling incidents. On their own, they meant little, but when viewed together, they painted a disturbing picture. At a church picnic in the summer of 1817, 10-year-old Agnes accidentally spilled a cup of cider. Witnesses recalled her going pale with fear, immediately stammering, "I'm sorry, Mother, please, I'm sorry." As she frantically tried to clean the mess, Elizabeth was quick to intervene with reassuring words for the onlookers. But as she helped Agnes up, her grip on the child's upper arm was so tight that her knuckles went white, a fleeting detail seen only by Miss Graves. The schoolteacher gently asked Agnes if she was all right. The child only nodded, refusing to lift her gaze from the ground. Miss Graves would later write in her diary, "That child acts as if a harsh word would break her. One wonders what discipline she might be under at that house." It was a fleeting thought, but it was a seed of doubt planted in a perceptive mind. Another oddity was the Johnsons' pattern of purchases. The owner of the general store noted that Elizabeth became one of his most regular customers, purchasing in bulk sacks of flour, cornmeal, salt pork, and occasionally bolts of the cheapest cloth. One month, she bought an enormous quantity of lye. Planning on making soap for the whole county? The store owner chuckled. Elizabeth simply smiled her serene smile. Cleanliness is next to godliness, especially with so many little ones about. The amounts were vast for the 1 or 2 children ever seen in public, yet just plausible enough to be dismissed as the work of a diligent, if slightly eccentric, housekeeper. A farmer tilling a field that bordered the Johnson property late one evening reported hearing a child's voice from the house, singing a strange, mournful lullaby over and over again. A tune he had never heard before and which made the hair on his arms stand up. By 1820, the carefully constructed illusion began to fray at the edges, leading to a strange midpoint climax in the community's perception. The secret in the attic had grown too large to be completely contained. Small things began to leak out. On a moonlit summer night, Mr. Pritchard, the neighbor, was walking home when he thought he heard what sounded like a child's muffled sobbing carried on the breeze. He paused, the sound of a snapping twig under his boot making him jump. He felt, distinctly, as if he were being watched from the darkened upper window of the Johnson house. He listened, heard nothing more, and then convinced himself it was just the wind. But the story spread. Soon, a tale began to circulate quietly in Oakside. The old Johnson place might be haunted by the spirit of a weeping child. The story metastasized, becoming a local legend among the village youth. Who would dare each other to run past the property line after dark? The Johnsons, far from discouraging these rumors, seemed to subtly cultivate them. Elizabeth, known to be fascinated by the local folklore of Salem, would speak of the house's spirits. Even Thomas, usually so taciturn, contributed to the tale. He told a group of men at the general store a completely fabricated, yet chillingly convincing story about a child from a previous family who had tragically drowned in the nearby marsh. On one occasion, a group of teenagers claimed to see a pale face in the Johnsons' attic window at dusk. Thomas scolded them for trespassing, but Elizabeth softly added, "This house does have its sorrows. The previous owners lost young ones to sickness, you know." It was a lie, but it served its purpose. The youths ran off, believing they had glimpsed an apparition. This was the brilliant, diabolical masterstroke of their deception. They took the very evidence of their crimes, the sounds of crying, the fleeting glimpse of a face, and twisted it into a ghostly legend. The community, already primed by superstition and a reluctance to interfere, latched onto this supernatural explanation. It was a grand revelation of a sort, but it was the wrong one. The village had discovered a secret at the Johnson farm, but they had named it ghost instead of monster. This collective delusion became the final, strongest lock on the attic door, allowing the horror within to continue, now shielded not just by walls and lies, but by the community's own willing blindness. The ghostly legend provided a convenient, comforting explanation, but for some, it was a veil too thin to hide the ugliness beneath. Miss Lucinda Graves, the schoolteacher, found no comfort in ghost stories. Her logical mind, coupled with the teacher's intuition for the welfare of children, could not dismiss the tangible fear she had seen in Agnes's eyes. She began to keep a more watchful, albeit discreet, eye on the Johnson property. In a diary, she noted small, disturbing details: the way the attic shutters were never opened, even on the brightest summer days, the absence of any childish laundry ever hanging on the line, the fleeting, gaunt face of a boy she did not recognize, peering for a second through a crack in the barn wall before vanishing. Once, she attempted to approach a young girl who was briefly allowed outside to weed the garden. But Elizabeth emerged from the house with an unnerving swiftness, her smile fixed but her eyes cold as ice, stating the child was too delicate for conversation. She voiced her concerns once more to Reverend Hill, but he, a man who built his life on the presumed goodness of his flock, cautioned her against spreading idle and potentially harmful gossip without clear proof. The community's denial was a fortress, and her suspicions were but a whisper against its stone walls. The fragile web of deception, however, was straining under its own weight. Small mistakes, born of arrogance or desperation, began to unravel the carefully laid plans. One frigid January morning in 1821, a delivery man found the Johnsons' front gate ajar and no one answering the door. Walking around the side of the house, he saw scratches on the exterior wall beneath the attic, as if made by small, desperate fingers. He swore he caught a glimpse of an eye watching him through a gap in a shutter before it snapped closed, when he later mentioned this to Thomas. The man's reply was brusque. "Raccoons," he'd grunted, turning away. But the most alarming incident occurred in March. A young serving girl named Nora, walking past the property at twilight, saw a thin, pale arm stretched through a broken pane in the attic window, desperately waving what looked like a strip of cloth, just as she froze in shock. The arm was violently yanked back inside. Fearful of causing trouble for servant girls who made accusations against landowners often found themselves jobless and disgraced, she confided what she'd seen only to her employer weeks later, who advised her to hold her tongue. All these warning signs were circulating like quiet whispers, but it took one final undeniable event to break the spell. It happened on the rainy night of October 28th, 1821. A sudden autumn storm rolled in off the Atlantic, lashing Oakside with a wind that howled like a grieving animal. Sometime close to midnight, a piercing scream cut through the roar of the storm. This was not a child's whimper or a ghostly sob. It was a shriek of raw, primal terror that rose and fell twice before being abruptly cut off, as if smothered. The scream came directly from the Johnson farm. At that moment, Mr. Abner Collins, the neighboring farmer, was in his barn checking on a pregnant cow. The sound made his blood run cold. He knew, with absolute certainty, it was human. Grabbing a lantern and his musket, he sprinted down the muddy road. As he approached, he could make out another sound beneath the din of the rain. Multiple voices crying and wailing from inside the house. Collins thundered on the front door, shouting Thomas's name. There was no answer. He circled to the back. And that's when he saw Thomas Johnson emerging from the root cellar, his face ghastly in a flash of lightning, his shirt stained with fresh dirt. One of the children had a nightmare, Thomas managed, a strange, forced smile on his face. But as he spoke, Collins could distinctly hear the muffled sobbing from the attic shutters above. He did not lower his gun. By now, other neighbors, including a terrified but resolute Miss Graves, had ventured out, their lanterns bobbing like lost souls in the dark. Together, they confronted Thomas. Elizabeth appeared behind him, her hair loose and her eyes wild. She too tried to claim nothing was amiss, but it was too late. A tiny, ghost-like face appeared at one of the attic windows, its mouth open in a silent plea. before it was pulled away. In that moment, any remaining doubt evaporated. The ensuing minutes were chaos. Collins and another man forced their way into the house, pushing past the protesting couple. Elizabeth's demeanor flipped from pleading to a feral fury. "This is my house. These are my children," she shrieked, clawing at Collins's face. Thomas lunged for a poker by the hearth, but was tackled to the floor by two farmers. Miss Graves, standing in the entryway, called out, "Children, help is here." This elicited a renewed chorus of desperate crying from above. It took precious minutes for the men to wrestle the key ring from Thomas's clenched fist and find the one that fit the heavy padlock on the attic door. Collins later recalled his hands shaking so badly he fumbled twice. Finally, the lock turned. The metal latch creaked as it released. Behind them, Elizabeth let out a wail of pure, animalistic despair. When Collins and the others opened that door, they were hit by a wave of stench and misery. The air was foul, a mix of sweat, urine, and sickness. Holding the lantern high, Collins stepped in, and what he saw would haunt him to the end of his days. 14 children, their thin bodies clad in filthy rags, cowered away from the light. Some were chained by the ankle to iron rings in the floor. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken and terrified. Many had bruises, and an older boy cradled a badly healed, crooked arm. An older girl was seen instinctively shielding a smaller, trembling boy behind her. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Miss Graves, having followed them up, gasped and rushed forward, bursting into tears as she tried to embrace the nearest child, who flinched from her touch. The spell was broken. John Sawyer, another farmer, reportedly muttered, "Dear God in heaven," before turning and retching onto the floorboards. One little boy, no older than 6, crawled forward and clasped his arms around Collins's leg, just kept saying, "Please, please," unable to form any other words. The full, monstrous truth of the Johnson household was finally, horribly, unveiled. The scene at the Johnson house that night was one of horror, but it was also one of profound relief. Village women, led by Miss Graves, gently led the children out of their prison. Many were so weak they could barely walk, squinting in pain as the cool night air hid their skin for the first time in years. Outside, neighbors wrapped them in blankets, sobbing openly at the sight of the frail figures emerging one by one. Meanwhile, Thomas and Elizabeth were tied to chairs in their own parlor. Elizabeth sat eerily calm, eyes closed, humming a discordant, tuneless lullaby. Thomas, conversely, ranted and spat, at times cursing the meddling fools, at others bizarrely quoting scripture about Abraham's sacrifice, his voice filled with a terrifying self-righteousness. By dawn, the sheriff of Essex County had arrived from Salem, as news spread like wildfire. The community's denial curdled into a potent mixture of guilt and murderous rage. The idea that this seemingly upright couple could perpetrate such cruelty was almost too much to comprehend. The avalanche of revelations had just begun. Investigators combed through the farmhouse. In the attic, they documented the chains, the crude woven mats the children were forced to make, and the squalid living conditions. They also found a small, locked box containing a ledger. Inside, in Elizabeth's neat script, were the names of the children, each followed by a series of cryptic marks and dates, chillingly reminiscent of an inventory list. Then came the most gruesome discovery of all. Beneath loose floorboards in a far corner, they found the small skeletal remains of 3 more children, buried in shallow graves. The press in Boston and New York printed lurid headlines, "Monsters in Massachusetts." The House of Horrors in Salem County. A wave of shock and revulsion washed over the public. Neighbors came forward. Their subtle warnings and dismissed suspicions now voiced openly, tinged with regret. Miss Graves wept as she gave her statement, her intuition tragically validated. The trial was swift, the courtroom packed with a crowd simmering with outrage. Those children who were old enough and strong enough to speak, like Agnes, now a young woman of 18, gave harrowing testimony. "We were beaten if we made any sound when visitors came," she recounted, her voice shaking. "We ate once a day, some days, nothing. We truly believed that if we were perfect and good, she would let us see the sun again." This portrait of psychological manipulation Elizabeth as a grotesque mother figure, Thomas as the brutal enforcer, chilled the courtroom. During the testimony, Elizabeth was seen to smile faintly, a chilling, detached expression that horrified the spectators. The jury delivered a unanimous verdict guilty on all counts, including murder. The judge, in his condemnation, said, "The very stones of Salem cry out for justice against you. You hid behind the veneer of piety only to perpetrate the most vile cruelty." The sentence was death by hanging. The bitter irony was lost on no one. More than a century after the witch trials, Salem had found itself rooting out a true witch-like evil. Only this time, the devil wore the polite smile of a neighbor. In the spring of 1822, barely half a year after that fateful, rain-lashed night, the final act of the Johnson tragedy unfolded into the Salem jail yard. The execution was not made into the grand public spectacle that some hangings had been in decades past. Official accounts suggest the authorities feared the crowd's wrath might boil over into a riot. Nevertheless, several hundred townspeople gathered in the streets nearby, a somber, silent congregation drawn to witness the finality of justice. As Elizabeth was led to the gallows, her eerie calm finally shattered. She broke a long silence, not with repentance, but with a final, chilling outburst of delusion. "They were mine!" she shrieked, her voice raw and piercing. "God gave them to me to test me!" Her words devolved into hysterics, cut short only by the hood and the noose. Thomas, in stark contrast, said nothing. He stared stonily ahead, his face an unreadable mask to the very end. When the trapdoors opened and their sentences were carried out, a collective hush fell over the gathering. An old farmer was heard to mutter, "May God have mercy on them, for the devil has surely had his due." A terrible chapter was closing, but its consequences were just beginning to ripple outwards. The collapse of the Johnsons' reign of terror was swift, but the redefinition of the community they had betrayed would be a slow, painful process. In the immediate aftermath, the 14 surviving children became the focus of a town grappling with its own complicity. Their arrival in Salem was a heartbreaking spectacle. Some of the younger ones cried out in fear at the sight of so many people, while others simply stared, catatonic, clutching the warm blankets they had been given as if they were the only solid things in the world. They were taken in by various families in Salem and Oakside, but this time, under a new and intense level of scrutiny, local women, including a determined Miss Lucinda Graves and a guilt-ridden Mrs. Rebecca Hill, formed a committee to oversee the welfare of each rescued child. Miss Graves took a particular interest in Agnes, spending hours simply sitting with the girl in silence until, weeks later, Agnes finally spoke, asking for a needle and thread. This was a nascent, almost revolutionary step, perhaps one of the first community-driven child protection efforts in the region. Donations poured in from horrified citizens across Massachusetts to fund their medical care and long-term needs. The children, however, were not just a cause, they were individuals, each bearing deep and unique scars. Some were eventually reunited with distant relatives who were tracked down through painstaking searches of church records. Others, for whom no family could be found, grew up under the foster care of kinder hearts than the ones that had nearly destroyed them. The ordeal forced Oakside, and indeed Massachusetts, to confront the rot that had festered beneath its pious surface. The easy trust that had once defined the community was replaced by a gnawing suspicion. Neighbors looked at each other differently, wondering what secrets might lie behind other closed doors. Reverend Hill, his faith in the inherent goodness of his flock shaken to its core, delivered a series of sermons not on piety, but on the sin of willful blindness, his voice heavy with a personal and collective guilt. For a time, it was said he considered abandoning the ministry altogether. He was overwhelmed by the feeling that he had personally failed to hear God's will through the cries of the suffering children. This soul-searching translated into modest, but significant, reforms. Authorities quietly instituted more oversight, requiring that town selectmen or church elders make quarterly visits to check on the conditions of any indentured or fostered children. It was an era long before formal social services, but the seeds of change, watered by outrage and remorse, had been planted. The legacy of the Johnson attic was, above all, a haunting one, echoing through the lives of the survivors and the conscience of the state. For the children, the physical scars began to heal, but the emotional wounds remained. In the years that followed, historical accounts and letters note that many of the older children struggled with what we would now recognize as profound trauma nightmares that tore them from sleep, a deep-seated difficulty in trusting adults, and lingering health issues from years of malnutrition. One of the youngest boys, who had been found chained, developed a lifelong terror of enclosed spaces, and for years could not sleep unless a window was wide open, no matter the weather. One older boy, when asked years later if he could forgive the Johnsons, responded solemnly, "I leave their souls to God. Forgiveness is not a thing I possess for them in this life." Yet, remarkably, amidst the darkness, there were stories of incredible resilience. Agnes, the oldest girl who had endured the longest captivity, eventually trained as a seamstress in Boston. It is said she married and had children of her own, vowing to give them the loving, sunlit childhood that had been stolen from her. Robert, the boy who would later pen a letter detailing their daily existence of terror, became a vocal advocate for better treatment of orphans. He would go on to testify before a state legislative committee in Boston. His quiet, dignified testimony about the horrors he endured proving instrumental in the push for the state's first formal orphanage regulations. Their strength stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of youth. The Johnson farmhouse itself became a dark monument. No one wanted to purchase the property after it was seized by the county. It stood empty, shuttered, and decaying for a long time, an architectural ghost on the edge of the village. One opportunistic newcomer to the area attempted to salvage some of the old timber, but was run off by a group of silent, grim-faced Oakside farmers who considered the ground cursed. Locals claimed it was truly haunted, not by the fictional spirits the Johnsons had once used as a ploy, but by the real, echoing cries of the children who had suffered there. A diary entry from 1829 by a Salem teenager describes a dare in which he and his friends snuck into the abandoned house one night. "We fancied we heard faint crying in the walls," he wrote. "We scarcely breathed until we were back outside. None of us will go there again." Eventually, the town decided the structure was a blight on its soul and had it demolished. By the 1840s, the house was gone. the land left as an open field where wildflowers grew each spring, a quiet, unmarked memorial. But what of the ultimate secret? The question of why the Johnsons committed their heinous acts was never truly answered. Were they driven by greed? Was it a form of madness? A deranged attempt by Elizabeth to fulfill a maternal longing through dominance. One whispered. Unsubstantiated theory at the time suggested they were adherents to a dark, forgotten folk belief that hoarding the life force of the young could grant longevity. In the absence of modern psychology, the people of that era fell back on the only explanation they had. They were simply evil, monsters in human guise. The truth of their motivations remains buried with them, a final, lingering secret lost to time. Today, the Johnson family tragedy is a relatively obscure footnote in the annals of American crime, overshadowed by more infamous events. Its records sat for many years, collecting dust in archives. Yet, to reflect on it is to confront an uncomfortable and timeless truth. The most profound moral of this story is that evil can wear a very ordinary face. The Johnsons, to their neighbors, were not horned demons or cackling villains. They were a mild-mannered husband and wife. The final, chilling memory many in Oakside had of Elizabeth was of her at the last town market before the discovery, gently stroking a child's cheek while buying molasses candies. Their case taught a hard lesson that monsters do not always lurk in distant, dark forests. Sometimes they live in the house next door, exchanging pleasantries over the fence by day, while perpetrating horrors behind closed doors at night. This realization profoundly shook the trusting foundation of communities like Oakside, forcing them to learn that blind trust can enable terrible abuse. The children's ordeal also underscored the vital importance of protecting society's most vulnerable. The suffering that took place in that attic, as horrific as it was, spurred others to act, contributing to the larger movement that would eventually establish formal systems to protect the innocent. But perhaps the most enduring warning the story leaves us with is about the nature of denial. The community of Oakside did not want to see the truth because it was too ugly, too disruptive to their perception of themselves and their world. They chose a ghost story over a human tragedy. It forces us to ask ourselves, what uncomfortable truths do we choose to ignore today in an age of endless information? What horrors in plain sight do we scroll past, dismissing them because confronting them would be too difficult? The attic where 14 children were locked away is more than just a historical location. It is a sobering symbol. It represents all the places in our world where the vulnerable can be trapped by those who should care for them. But it is also a reminder that such places can be discovered and broken open, if only we dare to look and refuse to turn away.